I died at 4:47 in the morning, 11 hours into a line that wrapped around a strip mall 3 times, for a console that would be back in stock by Christmas anyway. I want that on the record. Not a war, not a hospital bed, with people who loved me holding my hand. A parking lot in February, a folding chair with a broken leg, and a wind chill warning I'd screenshotted and then ignored because I'd already lost my spot once that week to a guy with a space heater, and I wasn't going to lose it again. The kid 2 spots ahead of me had a space heater too. He offered me exactly 0 degrees of its warmth. I want that on the record as well because I think it matters later. I think the universe or the system or whatever bureaucratic nightmare runs the back office of reality took notes. Here's what nobody tells you about freezing to death. It's not dramatic. There's no cinematic shiver, no last gasp. Your brain starts lying to you about being warm right before the end. Some evolutionary mercy, so ancient it doesn't know consoles exist. I remember being angry that I was comfortable. I remember thinking distinctly, I paid for this line with 11 hours of my one life, and I'm not even going to get the discount code. And then I remember nothing, which I've since learned is the least efficient way to end a sentence, a life, or a business quarter. Then there was a ledger. Not a bright light, not a tunnel. A ledger hanging in the black the way spreadsheets hang in your vision at 2 a.m. when you've been staring at pivot tables too long. Green text on nothing. It read, cause of death. Hypothermia, class preventable, subclass retail adjacent, asset, recovered, 1 times human soul, condition, frozen solid, grade, surprisingly intact, compensation package initiated. I remember thinking, even dead, compensation package with the same reflex a starving man has toward a menu. Some things don't die with you. Whatever built me cheap and durable, like a gas station lighter, and it turns out the part that survived, transferred to whatever came next, was the part that itemizes. System granted, eternal, permafrost, classification, elemental, ice, necromantic register. Note, per regional cosmology, ice is classified as a dead element. Standard practice is to bind dead element systems to hosts who die of exposure as a form of thematic efficiency. This is not a coincidence. This is a cost-saving measure. I want to be clear that I appreciated the honesty. Most systems I'd ever bought a subscription to lied harder than that. Then the black tore sideways, like a receipt ripping off a register, and I was somewhere with sky. I woke up on my back in snow so white it looked lit from underneath, staring up at a sky the color of a bruise that hadn't decided if it wanted to be blue or gray yet. My breath didn't fog. That was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing was that I wasn't cold, not in the way a body is supposed to be cold lying in snow in whatever this was. Pants. Sure, the exact clothes I died in, now perfectly dry. The third wrong thing, and the one that got me sitting upright fast enough to feel my neck crack, was the guy in ceremonial robes and to face like a man doing a job. He resented standing over me with a scroll and an expression that said he'd rather be literally anywhere else, including back in whatever office had generated the scroll. Kelvin, he said, mangling a syllable of my old name into something that stuck. By decree of the Crown of Vesahold, you are hereby granted title and lordships on the glacial reach, a sovereign holding of 40,000 acres, free of tax, free of levy, and free... Here, his mouth did something complicated, like it was chewing on a word it didn't like the taste of any expectation of return. I looked past him. White in every direction, not hills, not snow-capped anything. A glacier, actual ice going down into blue-black crevasses I could see from where I sat, wind moving across it invisible sheet like the whole landscape was exhaling. That's generous, I said, because 11 hours in a parking lot line teaches you to keep your face still while your brain runs numbers. What's the catch? The robed man's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one, the kind of expression bureaucrats make when a form is finally, mercifully, being filled out correctly. Ice is the province of the dead, my lord. Necromancers cultivate it, corpses keep in it, no crop grows on it, no beast thrives on it that isn't already something's ghoul thrall. The last 4 lords granted this reach did not survive their first winter. He rolled the scroll shut with a snap. The crown wishes you a comfortable tenure. There it was, the catch delivered with the same bright, hollow customer service energy as a store associate telling you the item you drove 40 minutes for sold out an hour ago. Actually, so sorry, here's a coupon for something you don't want. I've been murdered by a parking lot once already. I was not going to be murdered by a real estate scam dressed up as royal generosity. 4 lords, I repeated. 4. And where are their bodies? The bureaucrat blinked, the first genuinely human reaction I had gotten out of him. Preserved, my lord. It is, after all, very cold. I almost laughed. Somewhere behind my sternum, in the space where a heartbeat should have been doing something nervous, a very small, very cold, very calm part of me went,
"Oh, this is a supply chain problem. Frozen bodies, frozen land, a kingdom that considered ice a liability instead of an asset, apparently because nobody who'd been handed this deed had lived long enough to run a single spreadsheet on it." I stood up.
My boots didn't sink into the snow the way they should have, packed harder under me than the drifts around me, like the ground itself was deciding to be polite. First perk, maybe. I filed it away. I accept the grant, I said. The bureaucrat looked for one unguarded second, almost sorry for me. Then he rolled his shoulders back into professional indifference, produced a second scroll from absolutely nowhere, had me press a freezing thumb to a wax seal that hissed white when it touched my skin, and vanished in a fold of gray light that smelled faintly of old paper and colder things. I stood alone on 40,000 acres of glacier that had killed 4 men before me, with a system that had been engineered deliberately as a courtesy execution. A ledger unfurled in front of my eyes again, and this time I read it the way I used to read a lease before signing it. Every clause, every line hunting for the part where they screw you. Chosor, eternal permafrost. Status, active core mechanic, stasis binding. Any matter you consciously freeze enters. Stasis. Decay, decomposition, and entropic drift are halted for the duration that ice holds. This applies to organic matter, structures, and, pending further data, living tissue in controlled applications. Rank, frostbitten novice, 0/100 preservation. Note, XP in this system is earned through preservation, not destruction. Kills grant nothing. Things saved, kept, and kept usable. Grant everything. I read that twice. Every system I'd ever heard of in every story I'd half read waiting, in lines just like the one that killed me, ran on kill counts. Slay the beast, level up, become a god of violence one corpse at a time. Mine ran on not letting things rot. I looked down at my own hands, flexed frost-pale fingers that weren't shaking despite standing in a wind chill that should have been actively re-killing me, and felt something shift in my chest that wasn't quite hope. Hope was for people who hadn't died over a video game console. This was colder and more useful than hope. This was a business model. Okay, I said, to the wind, to the ice, to the 4 dead men somewhere out there proving the ground could hold a grudge. Let's see what a corpse element is worth when somebody finally runs the numbers on it right. The wind picked up as the light started dying, and I learned in order the following things about freezing to death a second time. First, that it apparently doesn't work on me anymore, because the cold that should have been climbing into my lungs instead sat against my skin, like a held breath, present but declining to act. Second, that the 4 previous lords hadn't died from the cold reaching them. The ice here had teeth. Wind that could flay a man's face down to something unrecognizable in under an hour, and none of them had had a system class flagged specifically ice immune host in fine print. I only found by scrolling the ledger sideways, which I did compulsively, because 11 hours of parking lot line teaches you nobody puts the important clause in the big font. Third, and this was the one that mattered, I found the first body an hour before full dark, half buried at the mouth of a crevasse, wrapped in a cloak on stiff as sheet metal, face turned toward the horizon like he'd been watching for something that never came. Lord number 1 or 2 or 4, no way to know which. The scroll bureaucrat's voice came back to me. Preserved, after all, it is very cold. Delivered like a joke I hadn't been meant to laugh at. I knelt next to him, not out of reverence, out of curiosity, the specific itchy curiosity of a man staring at a market nobody else had bothered to open. He wasn't rotted, 4 winters at minimum, maybe more, and his face was as intact as the day he'd stopped breathing. Skin waxy but whole, no scavengers, no decay, nothing but cold doing exactly what cold does, when nobody's harnessing it on purpose. The ledger chimed, unprompted. The tone I was going to learn meant the system had opinions. Observation, logged. Passive stasis detected in ambient environment. Preservation efficiency, 41%, unoptimized. Hint, conscious application of stasis binding increases preservation efficiency and grants preservation AWAGs. Try it, like it was a coupon code, like the system was standing behind a register with a QR code taped to a broken card reader telling me the discount definitely applies, just scan it. I put my palm flat against the dead man's chest, more out of morbid experiment than anything resembling respect, and thought, consciously, deliberately, the way you'd flex a muscle you'd never used before. Stay. Cold moved out of my hand like water finding a low point. Not a burst, not a spell effect with sound and light, just a settling, the way a held breath finally lets go, and the frost around the corpse sharpened into something with edges, something arranged, patterns like the inside of a snowflake blooming across his cloak, his skin, the ice beneath him, sealing him into a casing so clean it looked less like death and more like a specimen behind museum glass. Stasis binding, applied consciously, preservation efficiency, 97%, plus 12 XP rank progress, 12 over 100, 12 points. Off a corpse I hadn't even been trying that hard on. I did the math a heartbeat later, the same reflex that used to run unit economics on every deal that crossed my desk before I'd let myself get excited about it, and the number that came back made the cold, calm thing behind my sternum sit up properly for the first time. If a mediocre effort on one dead body was 12 points and the entire reach was 40,000 acres of untouched, unoptimized cold currently doing a mediocre 41% efficiency job on absolutely everything in it for free, then nobody, not the crown, not the 4 dead men, not the bureaucrat with his scroll and his pity, had the faintest idea what they'd actually handed me. They thought they were disposing of a body in a court-approved, plausibly deniable, thematically appropriate grave. They'd given a man who'd once queued 11 hours to save $40 on a game console sole and exclusive control of the only perfect, infinite, zero-cost cold storage facility on the entire continent. I looked out at the glacier. Miles of it, blue-shadowed under the last light, wind screaming low across ice that had buried 4 men and was, as far as I could now tell, entirely willing to keep me too, if I let it. Right, I said, and for the first time since the parking lot, since the folding chair, since the space heater I never got a single degree off of, something in my chest that wasn't a heartbeat felt almost like one. Anyway, let's talk terms. I did not, that first night, build a fire. I didn't need one, and more than that, some petty permanent part of me, the part that had died cold and unbothered and furious about it, decided that I was never going to be the one paying for warmth again. Everyone else could pay me for it instead. I laid the first dead lord back down, gently, the ice sealing over him, clean and a final, and marked the spot in my head the way you'd flag a listing you intended to come back and develop. Then I went looking for the second body, because if one corpse was 12 points, 4 were a business plan, and I had, it turned out, all the time in the world, and none of the reasons to be afraid of it that everyone standing between me and this glacier apparently expected me to have. System notification, quiet, almost polite, the last thing I read before the dark took the sky entirely. Eternal permafrost has noted unusually rapid adaptation. Accessing prior host records, 1 of 4 fragments unsealed. Yeah, fragment 1/4. I told them the ice doesn't take you, it keeps you. Nobody listened, and nobody ever. Record corrupted. Further fragments require additional rank progression. I read it twice, the way I'd read the grant, hunting for the clause where they screw you. I didn't find it, not yet, but I filed it away with everything else. The 4 dead men, the 40,000 acres, the bureaucrat's pity, the space heater I never got to use. In the same cold, patient, itemizing part of me that had survived the only trip through the black that mattered, somebody before me had figured out what this place actually was. Somebody before me had died before anyone would listen. I intended to make them listen by making them rich off me instead. Chapter 2. Inventory. By the 3rd day, I had found all 4 lords, sealed them properly, and stopped thinking of the glacier as a grave. That was the actual turning point, more than the system notification, more than the title deed, more than the thumbprint seal that still hadn't fully thawed off my hand. A grave is a place where value goes to stop. 40,000 acres of a substance that could stop decay itself on command was not a grave. It was the single largest cold storage facility in a world that apparently hadn't invented refrigeration, sitting empty, unleased, unmonetized, guarded by nothing but a reputation for killing people who didn't know what they were looking at. I knew what I was looking at. I had died in a line for a $40 discount. I recognized underpriced inventory when it was lying directly on top of me. The blizzard came on the fourth night, and it came the way I imagine hell would if hell had decided cold was more efficient than fire. No warning I could see, no darkening sky, just a wall of white that ate the horizon and then ate everything closer than the horizon. Wind so total, it had a physical weight, like the air itself had decided to lie down on me. I want to be honest, even immune to the cold itself, immune to frostbite, immune to the specific mechanism that had killed me the first time, I was not immune to wind that could move a man. I got flattened twice trying to reach the ridge where I'd been building what I optimistically called a shelter and what was, more accurately, a hole with ambitions. The second time I went down, I stayed down for a second too long, cheek against packed snow, and had the genuinely humbling thought that dying a second time on the same element in the same general manner would be the kind of joke the universe apparently loved enough to tell twice. Then something screamed, not human, not quite animal either, in any register I recognized, a low, cavernous bellow that came from somewhere below the wind instead of inside it, like the ground had a throat. I got my head up in time to see it, a shape moving through the whiteout that had no business being that large, hunched and shaggy and lit at the edges by the strange gray half-light the storm let through, tusks catching what little glow there was like scythes left out to rust. A mammoth, an actual, impossible, 12-foot at the shoulder mammoth, half buried in drift up to its knees, thrashing against something I couldn't see until the wind dropped for one merciful half-second and I saw the crevasse lip crumbling under its back legs, saw the ice giving way in slow, grinding increments, saw an animal the size of a delivery truck about to become the fifth body this glacier had swallowed since somebody started counting. Here's the part I'm least proud of and most useful for understanding what kind of person I actually am. My first thought was not, I should save this animal because it is suffering. My first thought, clear and fast and entirely uninvited, was that is 8,000 pounds of meat, hide, ivory, and hauling capacity currently on sale for the price of not letting it die, and nobody else on this entire continent has a bid in. I moved before the second thought caught up. I don't know if that says something good about me or just something efficient. Getting to the crevasse lip took longer than it should have, the wind fighting me for every yard, and by the time I reached it, the mammoth's back legs had gone through to nothing, its whole rear half hanging over blue-black dark, front legs scrabbling uselessly at snow that kept sliding out from under its claws, hooves, whatever a mammoth technically stood on. I genuinely didn't know, and it wasn't the time to find out. I did the only thing I had. I put both hands flat on the ice shelf under its front legs and thought as hard and as clearly as I'd ever thought anything hold. The stasis binding didn't work the way it had on the dead lord. There was no gentle settling, no polite arrangement of frost. It tore out of me like something had been waiting behind a dam, cold roaring down my arms and into the ice in a shock wave that turned the crumbling shelf instantly, violently solid, not just stopped from crumbling further, but locked, reformed, load-bearing, in a way raw ice at that temperature had no right to be. Stasis binding applied to inanimate structure under active stress. Efficiency, 63%. Panic application, precision penalty, plus 31 XP rank progress, 43 over 131 points for panicking correctly. I filed that away too. Distantly, the way you file away a coupon you'll definitely lose before you get a chance to use it, because at that exact moment, the mammoth's front legs found purchase on ice that was, seconds ago, actively killing it, and it hauled itself forward with a strength that nearly took my head off with a swinging tusk on the way past. It didn't run. That surprised me almost as much as the ice holding. It stood there instead, heaving, steam pouring off its flanks into air too cold to let it disperse dispersed properly, so it hung around the animal's head like it was smoking,
And it looked at me with one small, ancient, deeply unimpressed eye.
"You're welcome," I said, out loud into a wind that ate the words before they'd finished leaving my mouth. The mammoth did not appear to care about my need for validation. It lowered its head instead, slow, deliberate, and pressed its forehead, easily the size of my whole torso, against my chest hard enough to sit me down in the snow, and then just stayed there. A wall of heat and steam and slow, ancient breathing, immovable, blocking the worst of the wind with its own enormous body, like it had decided on some calculation I wasn't privy to, that the transaction wasn't finished. I sat there, half crushed under a woolly mammoth's forehead in the middle of a blizzard that had nearly killed us both, and laughed until it hurt, because I had just realized with the specific clarity that only comes from nearly dying twice in one way, that I did not currently have anywhere to put 8,000 pounds of mammoth, and that this was, by a wide margin, the best problem I had encountered since arriving. Eternal permafrost, unusual bond, detected. Would you like to designate unnamed mammoth as a bound asset? Bound assets receive passive stasis benefit from proximity to host. Bound assets do not count against personal preservation load. Bound asset, not pet, not companion. Asset, the exact word I would have used myself, delivered without a hint of irony by a system that apparently had been paying close enough attention to my internal monologue to know precisely which word would land. Yes, I said out loud to the mammoth and the storm and the ledger both. Obviously, yes. Naming required. I looked up at the animal currently trying to press me flat into a snowbank through sheer companionable weight, at the frost gathering on its eyelashes and not melting, at the deeply unimpressed eye still fixed on me like it was already regretting the decision, and said the only name that made any sense at all. Frostbite. Frostbite. Was a bound asset registered. Type mammoth. Elder, estimated age 340 years. Cause of prior near death, structural ice failure, recurring. Note: this individual has nearly died in this exact manner 6 times previously. Per ambient system record, consider improving structural stasis coverage across territory to prevent further incidents. This is potentially good business. 6 times. 340 years old, and this glacier had tried to eat this particular animal 6 separate times before I showed up, which meant it wasn't an accident, wasn't bad luck, wasn't even really about the mammoth at all. The ice here was actively unstable, not cursed, not haunted, nothing so dramatic, just unmaintained, the same way a strip mall parking lot goes to cracked asphalt and dead light bulbs when nobody in charge bothers to fix anything because they've already written the location off. I'd been handed 40,000 acres of neglected infrastructure and told it was a death sentence. It wasn't a death sentence. It was deferred maintenance with a body count, and I had, as of about 4 minutes ago, exactly the tool required to fix it. I spent the rest of that blizzard, hours, maybe most of the night, time meaning less and less the longer I went without needing sleep the way I used to, walking the ridge line with one hand trailing against the ice, laying stasis binding down in long, deliberate seams instead of the panicked burst that had saved frostbite, learning the difference between reinforcing structure and merely preserving it, watching the efficiency numbers climb every time I slowed down enough to actually think instead of react. Stasis binding. Structural application deliberate. Efficiency 88% plus 9 XP stasis binding plus some structural application deliberate efficiency 91% plus 11 XP stasis binding structural application deliberate efficiency 94% plus 13 XP rank progress 76 over 100. Frostbite followed me the entire way, patient and enormous, occasionally leaning into ridges I was working on with a weight that would have been dangerous from anything with less self-control, packing snow into place like the animal understood, on some level, exactly what I was doing and had decided to help. By the time the storm broke, sudden and total, the way it had arrived, clouds tearing open onto a sky scraped raw and clean and full of more stars than I'd ever actually seen with my old eyes in a lifetime spent under the orange smear of parking lot lighting. I had 91 seams of reinforced ice running the length of the eastern ridge. Oh, 340-year-old mammoth treating me with the specific deference of an animal that had finally, after 6 near deaths, met someone who fixed the actual problem instead of just surviving it, and a rank bar sitting at 91 out of 100. Eternal permafrost rank progress, 91 over 100 estimated time to next rank. Do not estimate. You are the fastest progressing host on current record. This note is not a compliment, this is a flag. I read that last line 3 times, standing under a sky full of unfamiliar stars, with a mammoth's trunk curled loosely, possessively around my shoulder, and felt the cold, calm, itemizing part of my chest do something it hadn't done since long before the parking lot. It felt, very specifically, like the beginning of due diligence on something enormous. Somewhere out there, past the edge of my 40,000 tax-free acres, was a kingdom that thought it had buried a problem, a temple that thought ice belonged exclusively to the dead, a market, somewhere south, warmer I assumed, hungrier for anything that didn't spoil, that had no idea what was about to be available to it. I didn't know yet how big any of that was. I didn't know about the elves, or the merchant, or the necromancer who was going to take deep personal offense at what I was about to do with her element. I didn't know that the fragment the system had shown me told them the ice doesn't take you, it keeps you, nobody listened, belonged to a man who tried this exact pitch to exactly the wrong people and paid for it with his life. I knew a mammoth was leaning on me like a very large, very warm, very opinionated dog, that I hadn't been cold in 4 days, despite standing in the coldest place I'd ever been, and that 91 seams of solid ice behind me were the first inventory this glacier had ever produced that wasn't a corpse. "Okay, big guy," I said, to Frostbite, to the stars, to the ledger still glowing faintly at the edge of my vision. "Let's go see what the rest of the neighborhood looks like." He grumbled something low and enormous in his chest, and for the first time since I'd woken up dead on the wrong side of my own life, I found I was actually looking forward to finding out. Chapter 3, Terms of Trade. We found the elves, or more accurately the elves found us, on the 7th day at the tree line where the glacier finally lost its argument with the world and gave way to black spruce bent nearly flat by generations of the same wind that had almost killed Frostbite 6 times before I arrived. I heard them before I saw them. Not footsteps, nothing so clumsy, but the specific quality of silence that means something is deliberately not making noise nearby, the kind of silence I used to feel in a store aisle when a manager was watching to see if I'd shoplift. I'd gotten good at reading that silence over the years. It never once meant I was safe. Frostbite smelled them first and didn't spook, which I'd already learned to treat as a more reliable signal than my own senses. He just slowed, swung his great head toward a stand of spruce, so uniformly gray-white they looked carved rather than grown, and made a low sound in his chest that wasn't quite the warning bellow from the crevasse, and wasn't quite a greeting either. 6 of them stepped out of cover at once, which told me immediately there'd been more than 6 watching, because nobody reveals their whole position unless they've already decided the encounter is going a specific way. Tall, narrow, skin the pale blue-white of skimmed milk, hair like frost, crystallized mid-fall, dressed in layered hide, and something that might have been woven ice silk, if that was a thing that could exist. Every one of them had a bow drawn, and every one of those bows was pointed at me, not the 12-foot mammoth standing next to me, which told me something too. Either they didn't consider Frostbite a threat, or they already knew exactly what he was, and had made peace with losing that particular fight a long time ago. The one in front, older, I guessed, from the way the others deferred their spacings to her without looking at her, the universal body language of a chain of command, had eyes the flat pale gray of a sky before snow, and a voice that came out precise and cold enough that I understood immediately she'd rehearsed the line before I'd shown up to hear it. "You're the 5th, she said. "We watched the ice take the other 4. We came to watch it take you as well. Instead, you tamed a reachback elder that has outlived 3 chieftains, and you have been laying stasis seams along the ridge like a man who intends to stay." "I do intend to stay," I said, and turns out the last 4 just didn't know what they had. Something moved behind her flat gray eyes. Not quite surprise. More like a woman doing rapid math she hadn't expected to need. You speak of the reach as though it were a possession to be managed. It is a possession to be managed. It's just been badly managed for a very long time. I nodded toward the tree line behind her, toward the shapes I could feel more than see, the ones who hadn't stepped out. How long have you been watching lords die out here without anyone asking your tribe what the ice was actually doing? That landed. I watched it land the same way I used to watch a pitch land across a table from a buyer who'd walked in skeptical. A very slight shift in weight, a very slight loosening around the eyes the moment someone stops treating you as a threat and starts treating you as a variable. My name is Ina Frostleaf, she said, after a pause, just long enough to mean something. I speak for what remains of the Sorrelkin. There were 11 clans on this glacier once. There is one now, and it is small, and it is dying by inches. Every winter the game thins, and the ice keeps its own counsel about who it will and won't kill. Her bow didn't lower, but her voice did, half a register into something closer to exhaustion than hostility. So before you tell me again how badly this land has been managed, human, tell me what you think you can do about 11 clans already gone. I want to be honest about what happened in my head in the 3 seconds after she said that, because I think it's the most important 3 seconds in this entire account of what came after. The old me, parking lot me, 11 hours for a console me burso would have felt something. Pity. Probably, or the specific guilty ache of hearing about a tragedy you had no part in and no power to fix. That me would have said something comforting and useless, and both of us would have known it was useless the moment it left my mouth. The me that had died and come back with a ledger in his head instead of a heartbeat did not feel that ache. What I felt instead, cold and clean and entirely without malice, was the specific, quiet excitement of hearing a problem stated precisely enough that I could already see 3 ways to solve it and get paid doing it. How many of your people know how to hunt, herd, or work hide? I said, and how many of those skills currently have nowhere useful to go because the game's too thin and the winters are too long? Aina blinked. It was, I would learn much later, the single most human expression she was capable of, and I'd gotten it out of her in under 2 minutes. All of them. That is the problem, human. Skill with nothing to spend it on is not wealth. It's grief with a trait attached. It's inventory, I said, which means it's an asset nobody's figured out how to price yet.
You've got hunters, herders, tanners, and a genuine elder mammoth who apparently likes me enough to lean on me in a blizzard.
I've got 40,000 acres of the only stable cold storage in this entire kingdom, a system that pays me for keeping things from rotting instead of killing them, and absolutely no idea how to run a trade route, because the last time I ran logistics for anything, it was standing in line for a discount that got rained out anyway. I let that sit a second. I'm not offering you charity, Frostleaf. I don't have any charity to offer. I died broke, and I intend to stay solvent this time around. I'm offering a partnership where your people stop losing skill to a glacier that's finally got a landlord who knows what he's sitting on. The boughs, one by one, came down. Not all at once. The 2 on her flanks held longest, the last holdouts in any negotiation, the ones who need to see the principal move first before they'll follow. But they came down, and Aina Frostleaf crossed the last 10 feet of packed snow between us, with the specific wary economy of someone who's been burned by exactly this kind of offer before, and is choosing deliberately, against every instinct that experience has taught her, to try again anyway. The last men to speak of partnership with the Sorrelkin, she said, close enough now that I could see frost forming and vanishing at the corner of her mouth with every word, an effect I would spend embarrassingly long trying to figure out later. Wanted our hunting grounds and called it an alliance until the ink dried. I don't want your hunting grounds, I said. I want your labor, your knowledge of this glacier, and eventually, if this works the way I think it will, a market big enough that nobody on your side has to choose between skill and survival ever again. In exchange, you get first claim on every job this reach produces, permanent shelter that isn't a grief-soaked tree line, and a landlord who will personally freeze anyone who tries what the last men tried. I held out a hand, the old world gesture, no idea if it meant anything here, and did it anyway because it was the only closing move I had left in my repertoire. Try me for 1 season. If I'm lying, you've lost nothing you didn't already expect to lose to this glacier regardless. Aina looked at my hand for a long moment, then passed it at Frostbite, who had lowered his enormous head to bring it level with hers, patient, ancient, and, I would swear, to this on anything you like, faintly approving. "The Elder trusts you," she said finally, and took my hand in a grip that was cold, in a way I registered without feeling, the way you'd notice a fact rather than an experience. "That is worth more than your words, human. Understand that clearly before we begin. Eternal permafrost, territorial alliance formed, Sorilkin clan, bonus condition met, preservation of a dying culture, passive. Plus 140x. P, rank up. Frostbitten novice to permafrost. Warden's new unlock, cold storage. Designate a structure as permanent stasis architecture. Preservation efficiency within designated structures, 99% plus. Structures require no ongoing maintenance cost from host." I stared at that last line for a long moment, doing the math the exact way I used to run numbers on a deal before I let myself feel good about it, and the number that came back this time didn't just make the cold, calm thing in my chest sit up. It stood up entirely, looked around at 40,000 acres, 6 wary elves, an elder mammoth, and a rank-up notification that had just handed me, free of charge, the single most valuable piece of infrastructure this entire cold, ice-poor, spoilage-prone kingdom didn't know it needed yet, and started, very quietly, to plan. "Aina," I said, "how would your people feel about building the first permanent structure this glacier has ever had that isn't a grave?" She looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something either brilliant or insane and hasn't yet decided which. "Show me," she said, "and I will decide if you're worth the risk." I'd been dead less than 2 weeks. I already liked those odds better than the ones I'd had alive. Chapter 4, The Coffin for Food. The box took the Sorrelkeen 9 days to build under my direction, and it took me most of those 9 days to stop calling it the box out loud in front of Aina, who had developed the specific habit of repeating my own words back to me with maximum flatness whenever she thought I was underselling something. "The box," she said the third time, hauling a lashed spruce panel into place with the effortless economy of someone who'd been building shelter against this exact wind her whole life, "is going to feed a kingdom, and you keep calling it the box. It's a working title. It's a bad one." She wasn't wrong, but she also wasn't the one who'd be standing in front of merchants trying to explain it, so I kept the box right up until the moment I stood in front of it. Finished mono, a squat structure of stacked ice block walls, sealed floor to ceiling, and stasis binding at 99% efficiency, insulated on the outside with packed snow and hide the way the Sorrelkin insulated their own shelters, with a heavy hide and timber door that sealed tight enough to hold a whole different climate inside it than the one 3 feet outside, and realized I needed a better word for it before I said it out loud to anyone who mattered. "Icebox," I said, finally, to Aina, to Frostbite, to the 6 Sorrelkin hunters who'd spent 9 days hauling ice and hide because I'd promised them a share of a market that, as far as any of us could prove yet, might not exist. Aina considered it. "Better," she allowed. "Still a bad name, but better. We loaded it before the first trade run with everything we had spare. Smoked mammoth hide off an old winter kill the Sorrelkin had been rationing, 3 barrels of berries preserved in ice-cold brine, and, at Aina's specific insistence, a haunch of fresh venison that she wanted proof on. Real proof, not my word for it. 6 weeks later, when we opened the icebox to load the first trade caravan south, the venison came out exactly as fresh as the day it went in. No graying, no smell, no give in the meat that told you decay had already started its quiet work underneath a clean-looking surface. Aina picked it up, turned it over twice, and looked at me with an expression I'd come to recognize as the specific respect she reserved for things that actually worked, which was rare enough that I'd started keeping count. 6 weeks, she said. "This should be carrion. That's the whole pitch," I said. The caravan south was 4 sleds, 6 Sorrelkin, 1 extremely reluctant mammoth handler who was not Frostbite himself. He refused, flatly, some ancient elder mammoth dignity that apparently did not extend to hauling, and me, walking the whole way because I still didn't fully trust my own balance on a sled going downhill at speed, a hesitation that had nothing to do with the system and everything to do with muscle memory from a body that used to bruise. The border town was called Thresh's Landing, a scab of a settlement where the glacier's foothills finally gave up and became something closer to farmland. Gray-brown mud instead of white. The first green I'd seen in over a month, standing out so violently I actually stopped walking to look at it. Word had apparently traveled ahead of us. 4 dead lords and a 5th who'd tamed an elder mammoth and struck an alliance with a clan everyone assumed extinct was, it turned out, exactly the kind of story that outran actual caravans. Because there was already a small, wary crowd at the town's edge by the time we arrived, and standing at the front of it, arms crossed, dressed in layered southern cottons that had clearly never once needed to survive real cold, was a priest. I want to describe him accurately, because he became, almost immediately, the single most useful enemy I would make in my entire career on this continent, and I owe him that much credit even now. He was young for a high cleric's collar, thin in the specific way of a man who fasted on principle rather than necessity, and he looked at the icebox, which we'd hauled disassembled and were rebuilding panel by panel in the town square, drawing a crowd that grew with every timber we lifted into place, with an expression of dawning, personal, almost wounded horror. "You mean to store food?" he said, once the walls were up and the door swung shut with that same satisfying climate-sealing thunk, inside a structure of the dead element. "I mean to preserve food," I said, inside a structure that stops it from rotting. "There's a difference." "Isekai does not preserve," he said, and I watched, with real fascination, an actual vein stand out at his temple. "Ice claims it is the province of the Reaper orders, the medium of the walking dead, the substance necromancers pack around a corpse to slow its return to the earth it's owed. You have built," he gestured at my icebox, my beautiful, functional 9 days of honest labor icebox, with a hand that trembled with what I can only describe as genuine theological offense. "A coffin for food. You are asking good people to store their bread and their meat inside a grave and to eat from it as though that is not the single most blasphemous transaction I have witnessed in 11 years of service to the temple." I could have argued theology. I'd had 6 weeks to think about exactly this conversation ever since the system had first flagged ice as a dead element back on day 1, and I had a whole prepared case about mechanism versus mythology, about how a thing being associated with death culturally didn't make it functionally identical to death, about efficiency and entropy and the actual observable physics of the situation currently sitting in the town square not rotting. I didn't use any of it. I'd learned a long time ago, in a life that ended over 11 hours and $40, that you don't win an argument with a man who needs to be right. You win a sale with a man who needs to eat. "Coffin for food," I repeated, slowly, like I was trying the phrase on. "That's good. That's genuinely good. Mind if I use that?" The priest blinked, thrown entirely off whatever rhythm his sermon had been building toward. What? "Coffin for food. It's memorable, it's got a hook." Every good product needs one, and Icebox was testing week with everyone I'd pitched it to before you. I turned to the gathering crowd, 30-40 people now, farmers and traders, and at least one very interested-looking woman near the back in southern desert weave I hadn't seen before, watching the whole exchange with the specific stillness of someone doing math in her head. You heard the man, the coffin for food, free demonstration, right now. Anyone want to bring me something you're worried will spoil before winter's out, and I'll show you it comes out exactly the way it went in. I watched the priest's face do something complicated and furious as he realized, roughly 3 seconds too late, that he'd just workshopped my marketing for me in front of his own congregation. "This is not a joke," he said, low, dangerous, the theological offense curdling now into something with teeth in it. "The temple will not stand by while a foreign lord teaches good people to treat a grave element as a pantry. There will be a reckoning for this, my lord. I promise you that." "Looking forward to it," I said, and meant it because a man threatening you with a reckoning in front of a crowd he'd just handed you the best slogan of your career from is a man who has already lost, and some cold, patient, itemizing part of me, the part that used to price out risk on every deal before I let myself get excited about it, filed his exact words away for later, the same way I'd filed away the fragment about the man before me who'd said nearly the same thing and paid for it with his life. Told them the ice doesn't take you, it keeps you. Nobody listened. I intended to make them listen a great deal more loudly than that. The demonstration ran for 2 hours. By the end of it, we had a line, an actual line, people standing patiently with baskets of berries and cuts of meat, and memorably, one entire wheel of cheese a farmer's wife swore was going bad within the week, and I stood at the front of it, taking inventory, making promises, running numbers in my head the way I used to run them on a spreadsheet, and felt, for the first time in this entire new life, something close to the specific satisfaction of a business finally actually working. The woman in desert weave waited until the crowd thinned before she approached, and up close she was older than I'd first guessed, hard-eyed in the particular way of someone who'd survived more than one bad trade row, with the kind of stillness that told me she'd been running numbers of her own the entire 2 hours. "Sarai Vasnari," she said, no preamble, extending a hand with 3 gold rings and calluses that didn't match the rings at all. "I run caravans out of Kassin, 400 miles south, where the sun does more work in a week than your storm did tonight, and where we lose a third of every grain shipment to spoilage before it clears the desert road." She glanced back at my icebox, still radiating its faint, impossible cold into the square. "The priest called it a coffin. I call it the only interesting thing anyone's built in this kingdom in a decade. What would it cost me to license the design?" "Not for sale," I said, and watched her expression sharpen with exactly the kind of respect I'd learned to recognize. "But I'll build you 3, deliver them myself, and take a percentage of everything that moves through them instead. You keep your margins on the grain. I take a cut of the spoilage, you stop losing." Sarai Vasnari looked at me for a long moment, calculating the same cold arithmetic I recognized because it was the same arithmetic running behind my own eyes. And then, slowly, she smiled, the first genuine one I'd gotten out of anyone south of the glacier. "A percentage of money I would otherwise have lost," she said, "costs me nothing at all to agree to." She shook my hand, grip firm, rings cold against my palm in a way I registered as fact rather than sensation, same as always. "You're either the smartest man to come out of that glacier in a century, my lord, or the temple is right and you're going to get us all cursed. Either way." Her smile widened, sharp and delighted. "I want to be there to see which." "Eternal permafrost, fierce southern trade contract secured, bonus condition met, element reclassification pressure, passive, temple opposition confirmed, plus 95 XP note. Temple hostility has been logged as an accelerant, not a penalty. The system does not care what the temple believes ice is for. The system cares what you make it do." I read that last line twice, standing in a muddy border town square with an icebox full of unspoiled meat, a furious priest already composing whatever letter he was about to send to whatever office handled continental blasphemy, and a southern merchant looking at me like I was either the best investment or the worst mistake of her career. I died over a $40 discount code. I was fairly sure, standing there, that I'd just closed my first real deal. It would not, I already suspected, be my last complicated relationship to walk out of that crowd. Chapter 5, Akith, Nocturne. She was already standing inside the icebox when I opened it the next morning, which should have been impossible, since I'd sealed the door myself the night before, and Frostbite had been posted outside it the entire time, and Frostbite did not, as a rule, let things past him that he hadn't personally decided to trust. I found out later he'd let her in because she'd walked straight up to him, unhurried in the dark, and told him, in a language I didn't recognize but he apparently did, that she had no interest in the meat, only in speaking to the man who'd built the box, and that if he didn't want a very unpleasant morning, he'd let her wait inside where it was, in her words, at least honestly cold. She was tall in the way that made you recalculate the doorway you just walked through, dressed in black on black layered robes that drank the pale morning light instead of reflecting it, with skin the color of old parchment and hair white not from age but from something closer to pigment loss, tied back hard enough to pull the skin at her temples. Her eyes were the wrong color for a face that otherwise looked human, a flat, matte black, no white showing at all, the kind of eyes that made you feel looked through rather than at. She was standing with one gloved hand resting, almost tenderly, on the wall of my icebox over the seam where I'd laid the thickest stasis binding, and the look on her face when she turned to me was the specific, quiet fury of someone watching a stranger wear their dead mother's jewelry to a party. Isolde Nocturne, she said before I could ask. Void Warden of the Cinder Chapter, 3rd Circle, and the first necromancer in 11 years to have to explain to her own order why a foreign lord's pantry is drawing more raw stasis current than a properly consecrated crypt. She tapped the wall once, gently, and I felt it through the ice like a struck bell, a resonance that had nothing to do with temperature. Do you have any idea what you've built here? An icebox, I said. It keeps food fresh. I've had this conversation with a priest already if you want to compare notes.
I'm not a priest!
And the words came out with a precision that suggested she found the comparison genuinely offensive. More offensive, if I was reading her correctly, than anything I'd done to her element. The temple believes ice is death because it is convenient theology for men who need corpses to stay put and grave robbers to stay scared. I am a necromancer. I have spent 19 years of study learning exactly what ice is at a level no priest and forgive me, no discount store peasant king could possibly grasp in a season of amateur experimentation, and what you have built here is not a pantry, my lord. Her black eyes didn't blink, not once, the entire time she spoke. It is the first properly functioning stasis architecture constructed on this continent in 400 years, and you built it by accident to keep cheese fresh. I want to be honest, I hadn't expected the conversation to go this direction, and some old parking lot instinct in me, the one that used to brace for a manager's complaint the second someone in a black uniform approached with that exact tone, braced for an argument. What I got instead, listening past the fury, was something closer to grief. You're not here to shut me down, I said, slowly, working it out loud the way I used to work out a client's real objection underneath the one they'd actually stated. You're here because I did something with your element that your entire order apparently forgot how to do. Something in her jaw tightened, just slightly, the first crack in a composure I suspected had taken years to build. Ice is not merely the medium of preservation for the dead, my lord. It was never only that. 4 centuries ago, before the Reaper orders codified the dead element doctrine and the temple found it profitable to agree with them, ice warding was a life discipline. Physicians used it, midwives used it. There are records, fragments, mostly, half of them burned in the doctrinal purges, of stasis wards that held plague at bay for entire villages, wounds that didn't fester because the surgeon's own hands carried a warding no one alive remembers how to cast anymore. Her gloved hand pressed flatter against the wall, and for a moment the fury dropped entirely out of her voice, replaced by something rawer. I have spent my entire career being told that what I feel when I touch ice, the sense that it is holding something rather than claiming it, is a novice's misunderstanding to be trained out of me. And then I felt this wall from 4 miles away, humming with the exact resonance my first instructor beat out of me at age 9 for describing it wrong. And I had to come see for myself whether the world had finally gone mad, or whether I had been right the entire time and simply been unlucky enough to be born 400 years too late to prove it. The icebox was very quiet. Somewhere outside it, faintly, I could hear Frostbite shifting his weight, patient as ever, and the ordinary sounds of Thresh's landing waking up around a structure it had spent the previous evening either praising or damning depending which crowd you'd stood in. So which is it, I said. Am I an accident or am I proof? Isolde Nocturne looked at me for a long moment with those flat black eyes, and something in her expression shifted, not warmth, not yet, but the specific recalibration of someone who has just decided an enemy might actually be a colleague. You are an accident who happens to be standing exactly where proof is required, she said, which is, in my experience, how every real discovery in this field has ever actually happened. Nobody sets out to prove ice can preserve life instead of merely marking its absence. Somebody dies wrong, gets handed the wrong system by an uncaring cosmology, and stumbles into it while trying not to lose a mammoth. She said the word mammoth with a faint, dry edge that told me Frostbite's negotiating tactics from the night before had made an impression. I should, by every professional obligation I hold, report this facility to my chapter as heretical misuse of a dead element and petition for its seizure and consecrated destruction. My stomach did something cold that had nothing to do with the system.
And instead, she said, I'm going to ask you an extremely inconvenient question, my lord, and I expect an honest answer because I have wasted 19 years of my life being correct in private, and I find I have very little patience left for being lied to in public. She stepped back from the wall, folding her gloved hands in front of her with the exact posture of someone about to cross-examine a witness. The system you carry, show me its full ledger, not the parts you've chosen to share with a farm town and a merchant. All of it. I hesitated. Old instinct, the specific caginess of a man who'd learned the hard way that showing your full hand to anyone ever tends to cost you the negotiation. And then thought about the fragment, told them the ice doesn't take you, it keeps you. Nobody listened. A man who'd tried exactly this pitch to exactly the wrong people and died for it. I didn't know yet if Isolde Nocturne was the right people or the wrong one.
But I knew, looking at the raw, exhausted hunger in her face, that she was at minimum the first person on this entire continent who might actually understand what I was building, instead of just profiting from it or condemning it. I opened the ledger and let her see. She read in silence for a long time, long enough that Frostbite eventually put his head through the icebox door, checking on me with the specific proprietary concern he had developed since the crevasse, and I waved him off with a hand I kept surprisingly steady. Isolde's black eyes moved over lines I couldn't see from where I stood, her expression cycling through something I could only describe as a scholar's version of grief. Until she reached, I watched her reach it, watched her whole body go very still, the fragment. Wei Chiu told them the ice doesn't take you, it keeps you. Nobody listened. Nobody ever... Where, she said very quietly, did this come from? Prior host record. The system's shown me one fragment so far, says there were 4 lords before me on this reach, all dead their first winter. I watched her face carefully. You know something. Isolde Nocturne closed her eyes, and for the first time since she'd stepped out of the shadows of my own icebox, she looked less like a void warden of the third circle, and more like a woman who had spent 19 years quietly certain of something nobody would let her prove, standing in the one room in the world that had finally handed her the evidence. 400 years ago, she said, eyes still closed. The last known practitioner of true ice wardings, the life discipline, not the Reaper doctrine, was tried by the temple for heresy. His name was struck from every surviving record. His texts were burned.
But before the pyre, witnesses recorded his final statement word for word because the temple wanted it preserved as a warning against exactly this kind of thinking.
She opened her eyes, and the black in them had never looked less empty. The ice does not take you. It keeps you. No one will listen until it keeps someone they cannot afford to lose. The wind outside had gone very still. Even Frostbite, I noticed, had stopped shifting his weight. You're telling me, I said slowly, that the man who invented this discipline 400 years ago said almost exactly the same thing the system just showed me from a lord who died on this glacier. What, 4 winters ago? 5. I am telling you, Isolde said, that either this reach has been quietly recruiting men who arrive already believing the same heresy, generation after generation, purely by coincidence, or something on this glacier has been trying to finish what he started for 400 years and killing everyone it chose except you. Eternal permafrost. Threshold condition met. Host has demonstrated verified continuity with suppressed ice warding doctrine. Pre-doctrinal purge, era unlisted, plus 210 XP, rank progress, permafrost warden, 88 over 100 accessing prior host records, 2 of 4 fragments unsealed, fragment 2/4. It isn't punishment. It was never punishment. They keep sending us here because something on this ice remembers how it used to work, and it needs a body patient enough and stubborn enough to finish rebuild. Record corrupted. Further fragments require additional rank progression. I read it twice, the way I'd read everything since the ledger first opened over my dying body in a parking lot that felt now like it belonged to somebody else's life. It needs a body patient enough and stubborn enough to finish rebuild. Isolde was watching my face while I read it, and whatever she saw there made her lose, for just a moment, every ounce of third circle composure she'd walked in with. You're not an accident, she said, quiet, almost reverent, almost afraid. You're a continuation. Something on this glacier has been trying to get someone to finish an argument that got a man burned alive 400 years ago, and it has apparently gone through 4 failed attempts before you arrived to prove, in 6 weeks, everything he died insisting was true. I thought about the 4 bodies I'd found, sealed now in careful stasis along the ridge, preserved perfectly, uselessly, monuments nobody but me had bothered to visit. I thought about the bureaucrat's flat professional pity. I thought about a kingdom and a temple that had spent 400 years calling a life discipline a death sentence because it was easier than admitting they'd murdered the man who'd tried to prove otherwise. And underneath all of that, cold and clear and entirely unbothered by the weight of 4 centuries and 4 corpses, the same itemizing part of my chest that had priced out a mammoth's hide before I'd even finished saving its life, did the only math that had ever really mattered to me. If someone had killed the last man for proving ice could keep life instead of just claiming it, and I was standing in a fully functional, profit-generating, alliance-backed proof of exactly that concept with a Void Warden and a merchant and an elf clan and a mammoth already on my side, then this time, when they came for the proof, they were going to find out it had already signed contracts. Isolde, I said, closing the ledger, meeting those flat black eyes that didn't feel empty anymore. How would the third circle feel about a business partner? For the first time since she'd stepped out of the dark, Isolde Nocturne actually smiled, thin and sharp and 400 years overdue. "Ask me again," she said, "once you've survived explaining this to my chapter." But I find, my lord, that for the first time in 19 years, I am genuinely curious to see you try. Outside the icebox, the wind picked back up, and somewhere south, a priest was already writing his letter, and somewhere further south than that, a merchant was already drawing up contracts, and somewhere out on the ridge, 4 dead men who'd never gotten the chance I had lay perfectly preserved under ice that had, it turned out, never once been trying to kill anyone at all. It had just been waiting for someone stubborn enough to listen. Isolde didn't leave that day or the next. She stayed the better part of a week, ostensibly to verify the resident's signature was stable, which I understood within about 2 days to mean she simply didn't want to go back to a chapter house full of colleagues who would either laugh at what she'd found or, worse, believe her and try to take it from me. She spent most of that week with her gloves off for the first time since I'd met her, bare hands flat against every seam of stasis binding on the property, murmuring measurements to herself in a clipped academic cadence that reminded me, uncomfortably, of every conference call I'd ever half listened to in my old life, except this one was about whether 400 years of doctrinal murder could be undone by a man who died over a video game console. Aina did not at first know what to make of her. The Sorelkin had their own long, complicated history with the Reaper orders. Old grief, old raids, old reasons an elf clan learns to read a black-robed stranger as a threat on sight. And it took 3 full days of Isolde methodically, patiently, unasked, reinforcing the stasis wards on the clan's own winter stores before Aina finally sat down across the fire from her and asked bluntly whether necromancers ever got cold. Constantly, Isolde said, without looking up from the ward she was tracing. We are simply better at pretending otherwise. It is largely a matter of posture. Aina laughed, a real one, short and startled, the first I'd heard out of her, and something in the camp's whole temperature, figurative if not literal, shifted after that. I noticed it the way I used to notice a deal, quietly closing itself in the room before anyone said the actual words. Fewer wary glances, more shared work, Frostbite eventually condescending to let Isolde scratch the specific spot behind his left tusk that apparently no one else had ever correctly identified. Sarai's second caravan arrived on the 9th day, 3 ice block wagons in tow, built exactly to my specification, and she took one look at the black-robed woman helping a Sorelkin hunter reinforce a grain store and did not so much as blink. "A necromancer," she said to me sidelong, watching Isolde work with the flat, assessing calm of a woman pricing out a new asset class. Officially blessing your storage wards, I assume, given how the temple's been talking about you 3 towns south of here. She's not blessing anything. She's confirming I'm not lying about the physics. Physics, Sarai repeated, testing the word the way she tested everything for weight and resale value. You know, my lord, in Kasine, we don't have a word that separates those 2 ideas quite as cleanly as you do. A thing that works reliably enough often enough, is the blessing, as far as most merchants are concerned. She watched Isolde straighten, wipe frost from her bare hands, and say something to Ina that made the elf woman laugh again. "You're building something strange here." Strange enough, I've already written to my cousin in the capital exchange to quietly buy land options on every trade road between here and the border before anyone smarter than me works out what's about to happen to spoilage rates across the entire southern grain trade. "You could have just told me you were doing that." "I could have," Sarai agreed, entirely unbothered. "But you'd have priced it into our next contract. And I am, my lord, a businesswoman first, and an admirer of your glacier a distant second." She smiled, sharp and genuine both. "Don't take it personally. It's the highest compliment I know how to pay a man." I was starting to understand, watching the three of them orbit the same fire that week. Ina's wary loyalty hardening into something warmer, Sarai's calculating respect sharpening into something that looked, if I squinted, almost like interest. Isolde's 400 years overdue vindication settling into a stillness around me that felt less like professional curiosity and more, every day, like she'd simply decided to stay, that I had accidentally built more than a trade route and a cold storage empire. I decided, with the same itemizing part of my chest that had priced a mammoth's hide before I'd finished saving it, that I was not going to pretend otherwise, and that I was also not, under any circumstances, going to be the one who brought it up first. Some risks you price, some risks you just let compound. The letter came on the 12th day, carried by a rider in crown colors who'd clearly pushed his horse hard enough that the animal was blowing steam from a mile out, and who'd dismounted at the edge of the camp with the specific over-formal stiffness of a man delivering news he suspected wouldn't be well received. "By order of the Crown of Vesahold," he read, not quite meeting my eyes, "an inspector of the Royal Treasury will arrive at the glacial reach within the fortnight to assess reports of unauthorized economic activity, unregistered territorial alliance, and..." His voice caught very slightly on the next clause, like even he found it absurd reading it aloud. "Unlicensed use of a dead element for purposes inconsistent with its granted classification." I looked past him, at the icebox standing solid and humming faintly in the cold afternoon light, at Aina and Isolde still laughing by the fire, at Sarai's 3 new wagons lined up and loaded, at Frostbite dozing against the wall of a structure that had, 4 winters running, been nothing but a grave until 6 weeks ago. Eternal permafrost. Rank, permafrost warden, 88/100. Note, Crown scrutiny incoming, historical precedent, 4/4 prior hosts, indicates this is the point at which the pattern typically resolves in host termination. You are, as of this notification, the longest surviving host on record by a margin of 11 months. This is not a warning. This is a market update. I read that last line, and for the first time since I'd woken up dead in a snowbank with a title deed and a death sentence disguised as a gift, the cold, calm, patient thing behind my sternum didn't feel careful. It felt, very specifically, like a man who just watched a competitor announce publicly and with terrible timing that they'd finally noticed the market he'd already cornered. "Tell the Crown," I said to the rider, "that the Reach would be delighted to host an inspector. Tell them to bring an appetite. We've got quite a lot to show them that doesn't spoil." The rider blinked, clearly having expected panic or defiance or anything other than a man smiling faintly at a death threat wrapped in treasury paperwork. I didn't blame him. I'd have been confused too once by a man who learned to price a threat before he let himself feel it. I just wasn't that man anymore. That man had died in a parking lot, uncompensated, for the crime of standing in line and trusting that the system, small si, would eventually be fair to him if he just waited long enough. This system had a capital letter, 4 dead predecessors, and a business plan finally worth defending. I intended to make sure the 5th name on that list was the one the Crown remembered longest, and for entirely the wrong reasons. That night, I walked the ridge alone, the way I had on the first night, before Frostbite, before Aina, before an exiled Void Warden decided a man who'd died over a discount code was worth staking her whole career's quiet certainty on. The 4 sealed lords were still there, under their clean, undisturbed ice, faces turned toward a horizon none of them had lived to see anything cross. I stopped at the first one, the one I'd found that very first evening, the one whose chest I'd put my palm against out of nothing more than curiosity. and crouched down the way I had that night, except this time I wasn't running the numbers on what he was worth. 2 fragments down, I said, to a dead man who couldn't hear me, to a system that probably could. Whatever you were trying to finish, whatever got you killed for it the first time around 400 years before either of us showed up, I've got a mammoth, an elf clan, a merchant with better instincts than mine, and a necromancer who just spent a week proving your own doctrine right with her bare hands. I've got a crown sending an inspector because they finally noticed the thing they threw away was worth something. I looked up, out over 40,000 acres of ice that had never once, I now understood, actually wanted any of this. You didn't get the chance to finish the argument. I'm not planning on losing it either. The wind moved across the glacier the way it always did, indifferent, ancient, patient, in a way I was only just beginning to understand wasn't malice at all. Eternal permafrost. Day 84. Rank: Permafrost Warden. 91 over 100. Bound assets: 1. Frostbite, Elder Mammoth. Territorial alliances: 1. Sorrelkin Clan. Active contracts: 1. Vasnari, Trade House. Kasine, Relationship. Flags: 3. Undefined. Host has not designated terms. Incoming: Crown Inspector, Royal Treasury, ETA 11 days. Projection: insufficient data. You have already outperformed every model this system was built to expect. Proceed accordingly. I closed the ledger, stood, and looked back down the ridge toward the fire. 3 silhouettes still sitting around it, a mammoth's enormous shape settled protectively nearby, warm light thrown up against a sky finally, gradually, starting to feel less like a sentence and more like the first quarter of something I actually wanted to see finished. 84 days ago, I died in a parking lot for 11 hours and $40, uncompensated, unmourned by anyone but a resentful kid with a space heater he wouldn't share. I was not whatever else came next. Inspectors, temples, 400-year-old heresies, a crown that was about to learn exactly how expensive it was to threaten the only stable cold storage operation on the continent, ever going to let anyone freeze me out of a deal again without making them pay retail for the privilege. I walked back down towards the fire, and for the first time since I'd learned what dying actually felt like, I wasn't in any hurry at all.